Okay, this will be an episode of something I call AWA Unabridged. We're going to go back and look at the great promotion called the AWA, just talk a little bit about it today. And what better guest to talk about the AWA than my good, long-time, close personal friend, Mick Karch. Mick, thanks for joining us again, and just tell us your involvement with the AWA and why it's so special to you.
Well, the AWA was my hometown promotion, Tim, and I grew up with it from the time I was 9 years old. It was all AWA, and just watching all the greats back in the day, I eventually got directly involved with the AWA in the early 1970s. I was writing a wrestling column for a local Minneapolis newspaper called the Minneapolis Daily American, and through that, I was working directly with Wally Carbo, actually, in putting publicity blurbs, writing about the AWA pretty much every week in the Daily American. So the publicity part of what I was doing with the wrestling office lasted about 13 years. And then in 1987 is when I actually started doing announcing for the AWA. Just to backstep a little bit, George Shire and I had done commentary for a wrestling promotion called the West 4, which was an offshoot of the NWA promotion up in Winnipeg, Canada, in 1986. And we actually invited Nick Bockwinkel, the late great Nick Bockwinkel, over to George's house to watch and kind of critique our announcing that we did for that West 4 promotion and tell us what he thought about it. Nick was very, very impressed, and lo and behold, unbeknownst to me, Nick was kind of putting me over to the AWA office. And in the summer of 1987, I was working at my full-time job. I got a call from Greg Gagne, and Greg said he had seen some of my work. He had talked to Nick. Would I be interested in working with the AWA as a ring announcer at their Showboat in Las Vegas tapings for ESPN? And, of course, it was a dream come true for me. I was just ecstatic. I said, how soon do I start? And that was kind of the beginning of it. I not only did ring announcing out there, but occasionally they would slide me into the color commentary position along with Rod Trongard. And that was really the beginning of my foray into the AWA. And it's kind of interesting. A lot of people, when they talk about me, will say he's the former AWA announcer. Well, my actual stint announcing for the AWA was only about 5 or 6 months, because in early 1988, I left the AWA and started Saturday Night at Ringside. But, you know, as it turns out, being on ESPN, and now it's ESPN Classics, and you can see it on YouTube, it kind of is out there living forever. So if I'm identified as being the AWA announcer, that's just fine by me, because it's my all-time favorite promotion. My true wrestling heroes are or were with the AWA. And, yeah, if that's my legacy, AWA announcer, that's fine by me.
Well, yeah, and we thank you for joining us, and I can echo many of the things you said. AWA was kind of my hometown promotion. Growing up, I lived in Wisconsin, but we would come up to the Twin Cities because all of our relatives lived up there, so every Thanksgiving and Christmas, and they would put the card in the paper. They'd usually have a Thanksgiving night card even back then in the 80s, and they would put it in the paper that morning. I'd be at my grandpa's house, and it would be like, tonight at the, I believe it was the St. Paul Civic Center is where I went to most of my events, and they'd be promoting people like the Road Warriors or Rick Martel, Nick Bockwinkel, of course, and it was just growing up, just watching those guys and getting to go to the live events, and then like you said, was that about 1988 it came out on ESPN, maybe even a year before that, and so being able to come home from school, rush home from school, and watch the AWA on ESPN, I mean, you used to only be able to watch wrestling on the weekends and maybe one night of the week, but never right when you got home from school, so it gave me personally something to look forward to, but just a group of great wrestlers, great talent, and and just great people, and I'm so glad that the AWA has such a history, and it's been saved now with DVDs and other things, and yeah, YouTube and stuff like that. And so I thought we'd maybe talk a little bit about just talk about some wrestlers and see where some of the stories can take us today. And well, one of the wrestlers that's been in the news lately, and not even for kind of sad reasons, but just a great guy, was Leon White, and he wrestled in the AWA, I believe, as Leon Baby Bull White, and most fans would know him as Vader, as that's what he kind of wrestled in WCW and WWF for the 90s. But he had quite the stay in the AWA in the late 80s, and that's kind of where he really got developed and made a name for himself for the first time.
You know, it's kind of remindful of how Mark Callaway developed into the Undertaker, and I say that because when Vader was in the AWA as Leon White, yes, he was a great big tough babyface wrestler, and he had somewhat of a run, relatively popular, but the character Leon Baby Bull White, you would never have imagined would transform into as big a global superstar as Vader. And that's why I use the Mark Callaway example, too, because if you think back to his days, not only in world class or global, but even in his early NWA days, he's kind of a milquetoast wrestler. Yeah, he's a big, strong kid, but right place, right time, right gimmick, and the legend of Vader is incredible. And sad to say, you mentioned he announced via Twitter just a couple of days ago that he is suffering from congestive heart failure, and as such, the prognosis from his doctors has not been very good. And according to him, he has a couple of years left at best, which is very, very sad. When you look at the real superstars in wrestling, and I'm talking about on a global level, particularly in Japan, as big as Vader was here in the United States, whether it was in WWF, WWE, or NWA when he was managed by Harley Race or WCW, he was such a massive presence in Japan all those years, and legendary is begin to describe it. So, again, very, very sad news about Vader. We certainly wish him all the best in the world. Going to be a struggle ahead from a health perspective, but his AWA stint, again, I'm not trying to diminish it or demean it. He was there. I mean, he was kind of along the lines of Scott Hall, who made a relatively good career in the AWA. When he left, of course, and morphed into Razor Ramon, it was something else again. Leon White, former football player, every bit of 400 pounds, legendary tough guy in professional wrestling. So our best to him. Very sad news.
Yeah, over the years, I've had a chance to run into him a couple times, and one time was at a convention, and it was for breakfast in that morning, and I actually was lucky enough I got to sit and talk to him for about 10-15 minutes, and I was just floored at what a nice guy he was. And just because you hear this, he was a tough guy in the locker room, and you hear some stories of maybe some fights, and he kept the locker room at bay. And I mean, I know, I've never been a wrestler, so I don't know what all happens back there, but I know it can get testy at times. But just to sit and talk to him for 10 minutes, one of the classiest guys I've ever met, just nice. He cared about the fans. Other fans would come up and talk to him and want a picture or an autograph, and he would just do it. And it was just like he almost enjoyed doing it. And that really, I mean, there's some wrestlers that just surprise you. You think he's just gonna be this gruff guy who's just kind of gets through and doesn't want to be bothered, but it was exactly the opposite with him. He was just such a class guy, and so I was just really sad to hear the news, and I hope that he just I hope he gets better, and that maybe that there's things that they can do with health, and that he'll just still have a very productive long rest of his life, because he left such a positive thing for me. But yeah, back in the AWA, I mean, watching him, it's just, I think the AWA was really good for him to just hone his skills, and while his character wasn't quite developed yet, his wrestling just seemed to get better and better every week, and I'm sure the AWA trainers, Vern, and everyone else who was training him at the time were just working with him because he had a lot of talent, and they just seemed to find the best in that, and then he just needed that change of scenery then for a new character to come out to just even take off to the next level, but I'm sure he would give a lot of credit to the AWA for being such a great place to start and for where he could get his skills honed.
Well, there's no doubt about it. The AWA really, in a lot of ways, Tim, was kind of a cutting teeth territory for guys who went on to great things. And, the most obvious one, I think, is Ric Flair. Ric Flair in the AWA, again, big, strong, tough kid. When he left the AWA, went down to the Carolinas, and, the rest is history and legendary from there. So again, whether it's Vern Gagne, Billy Robinson, whoever the trainers were at the time, the AWA, in a lot of ways, really molded wrestlers. So when they went on to another promotion, the sky was the limit.
Yeah. Well, there was another wrestler that I was thinking about that, and almost maybe kind of had the opposite happen to him, and that's Boris Zhukov. And I remember, in the 80s, and I don't know if the 80s were, as a lifestyle, was much different than today. With today, we worry about things like ISIS and stuff, and I don't even think you would ever cross ISIS into a wrestling storyline. But in the 80s, we had the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and I think every promotion had at least one Russian bad guy in the promotion, just taking advantage of that natural, like, ooh, we don't like the Russians and they don't like us. And for a while there, the AWA had Boris Zhukov, and I believe he teamed up with Soldat Ustinov for a while. But Boris was just an amazing his character in the AWA had to be the height of his career, and I thought out of everybody who had a Russian bad guy, I thought Boris was by far the best.
Well, what's interesting about Boris Zhukov, and so many of the Russian wrestlers, who of course were not Russian, whether you want to talk about Nikolai Volkov or Nikita Koloff, the Kalmykov brothers, way back when in the AWA days, Ivan Koloff, all the guys that had a Russian persona. And, of course, our friend Boris Zhukov, who started as Private Jim Nelson, wrestling down south. He's an American soldier, and then all of a sudden he comes up north, and he's a communist, bald-headed Russian. Boris, first of all, I want to say on a personal level, I'm still friends with him on Facebook after all these years. Terrific guy. Soft-spoken, just a great guy to talk to and hang around with. And what's interesting about Boris, you talked about, again, the AWA as opposed to when he went on to WWE. When Boris was in the AWA, you've got to remember the time frame. You're talking late 80s, so the AWA's better days were behind them. So as strong as a guy might have been in comparison to what people were looking at in the WWE, the AWA all of a sudden, they didn't have the glitz and the glamour and the pyrotechnics and whatever else that a wrestler had in WWE. So Boris, to me, was as strong or stronger a performer as he was in the AWA, but it was the trappings, it was the window dressing that he got when he went to the WWE that really manifested it and developed him into a full-fledged, great main event heel character, part of the Bolsheviks. Again, it's all part of the era. I remember when Boris was here, he had some great matches, with Sergeant Slaughter and Wahoo McDaniel. I know he had a strap match on ESPN. A great wrestler, and to me, very underrated when he was in the AWA. He teamed up, as you said, Tim, with Soldat Ustinov. And Soldat Ustinov started with Eddie Sharkey's EWA promotion here in the Twin Cities. He wrestled as the Russian Crusher, but again, I talk about guys who have this persona, this Russian persona, and Soldat was Jim Lanning from the Minneapolis area. And again, right place, right time, right gimmick, right persona. They were a great tag team when I was with the AWA back in 1987 or so. But getting back to Boris, just a class act all the way. And I am very, very happy for the success that he attained, not only in the AWA, but also when he went out to the WWE. Just a great, great guy. And as I said, we continue to talk to each other on Facebook, and just a longtime friend.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard nothing but positive things said about him in the wrestling world, and yeah, I think he was just another example of he was just a great wrestler. Yeah, maybe he didn't have all of the cartoon stuff that the WWF had at the time, but he could sure perform in the ring, and he made himself such a believable bad guy that, I mean, I've never had the opportunity to meet him, actually, but I'm worried someday if I run into him, I'm just going to feel this natural heat, because it's going to flash back to the 80s when I just did not like him at all, because he was the bad guy Russian. And I've met a few of those guys over the years, and you know that they've done well when the first time I meet them, there's still that just a little bit of heat, because I hated them so much when I was a kid that I still have to get over that and realize how good they actually did. So, yeah, Boris Zhukov, when I think of AWA during the 80s, which is when I was able to watch it, he was certainly one of the stars, and I'm so glad that he was able to perform for us. And like you said, everything I've heard about him is a great guy. So thank you, Boris, for entertaining me as a kid and giving me someone that my heroes could hopefully go after sometimes. Well, another guy who, I mean, just as much heat as Boris for me as a youngster, and a very unique character who didn't really do much, I don't think, and maybe you can shed some light on this, outside the AWA, was Colonel De Beers. But I know in the the 87, 88 time frame, he had to be one of the most hated. Like, PWI would put him as like the most hated wrestler because he was garnishing so much heat. He had a very unique gimmick of South African apartheid, and maybe you can take it from there.
Colonel De Beers, Ed Wiskoski. He wrestled for many years as Easy Ed Wiskoski. He had a real brief stint, actually. Not a lot of fans will remember this in the WWF. They brought him in as the Polish Prince. That didn't last very long. But again, as I mentioned, his run, he teamed up with Playboy Buddy Rose up in the Portland area, really wrestled all over the world. And when he came to the AWA with the Colonel De Beers persona that you mentioned, the South African apartheid, what was interesting about that, Tim, for Vern Gagne, that was really a stretch because, wrestling has always had the hated Japanese, the hated Russians, whatever, throughout the years. That was really kind of pushing the envelope for Vern because if you recall, part of his gimmick was that he didn't want to get in the ring and wrestle a person of color. And that was really something that was very, very controversial. Vern usually played it pretty close to the book. And for him to go to that extreme, I know that De Beers had a raging feud with Jimmy Snuka early on those ESPN TV tapings. And again, it was all about him not wanting to soil his hands by getting into the ring with a person who wasn't Caucasian. So that was really, really not only cutting edge, it was over the top, almost too much. And you mentioned the heat that he had. It was incredible. I know that he had some physical threats that were made to him, through mail to the wrestling office or whatever. He had towards the end of his AWA run, he also was wrestling Derek Dukes. Derek Starfire Dukes, a local wrestler who had started in the PWA promotion for Eddie Sharkey. And Dukes, again, an African-American. Again, they did an angle which was, are you kidding me, that if Colonel De Beers defeated Derek Dukes, he would be painted white. Dukes would be. I don't remember if it was the inverse where Colonel De Beers would be painted black if he lost, but I mean, it was just something way, way off the charts. so totally out of character for the AWA promotion. Now, getting back to Ed Wiskoski, I haven't seen Ed for many, many years. He used to be a regular at Cauliflower Alley Club, and coincidentally, I don't know if this is why he hasn't come back. When Playboy Buddy Rose, his business partner, passed away, that effectively was it. I may have seen Ed one more time after that, but otherwise he just kind of, I don't know where he is, what he's doing these days, but in the annals of AWA wrestling, as far as the guys who garnered legitimate heat, definitely you've got to put Colonel De Beers right near the top, no question.
Yeah, and once again, for me as a youngster, it was just so amazing, and yeah, there was just some natural heat there, and because, yeah, Jimmy Superfly Snuka, I mean, who couldn't love him, and for him to just be, yet I don't think I probably understood the whole storyline of what was going on. I wasn't old enough yet, but I did understand the heat there, and the hatred in the ring, and so, looking back at the videos, it's just, he's another one of those guys that just gives me that natural, man, you did a great job, because I still have this heat on you 25 years later, and that's just because of the way that you that you entertained me when I was young. And well, someone who maybe I have a little bit more fonder memory of, and just, I mean, and that's, I'm just reading down this list of AWA wrestlers, and the uniqueness is just amazing. But the Mountain from Stone Mountain, Jerry Blackwell.
Jerry Blackwell, who of course had wrestled as Crusher Blackwell before he came to the AWA. When you talk about the big men in pro wrestling, Tim, you know, originally or right off the top, you'll think of Andre the Giant, or you might think of Big John Studd or Bruiser Brody. In terms of height, Jerry Blackwell was not the biggest guy in the world. He might have been 5'9", you know, 5'10", maybe. But he weighed every bit of 450, 460 pounds. The most agile big man I have ever seen in pro wrestling, that a guy his size could throw a drop kick, or let alone the stamina that he had, where he could get into the ring with a guy like Greg Gagne and go 25, 30 minutes. Jerry was absolutely extraordinary. And for people who don't recall his initial foray into the AWA, he came in as what they wanted to be a babyface character. He was going to be kind of along the likes of a Haystack Calhoun or an Uncle Elmer, heaven forbid, somebody along those lines, and they called him Farmer Blackwell when he debuted. Well, it wasn't very long after that he morphed into Jerry Blackwell. Of course, he started the feud with the legendary Crusher Lasowski over who was the real Crusher in the AWA area. That went on for many, many years. His feud with Mad Dog Vachon, legendary, one of the great AWA TV promos of all time. People still talk about it. They look it up on YouTube. Is Mad Dog Vachon building a casket for Jerry Blackwell, and Gene Okerlund, you know, happens upon Mad Dog in Mad Dog's workshop, and here Mad Dog's got a hammer and nails, and he's putting together a pine box, and he's going to send Jerry Blackwell, you know, off into the next world. Their matches were tremendous. They were vicious. They were legendary. So one thing that I always say, people ask me what was my favorite match in AWA history, and coincidentally, it involved Jerry Blackwell, and this was June 10th of 1984. It was at the St. Paul Civic Center, and they were doing a $100,000 battle royal. And the storyline leading up to that was that Jerry Blackwell was aligned, of course, with Sheik Adnan Al-KC and Sheik's army at the time. Was starting to get on Adnan's nerves a little bit. Bottom line is, Jerry wins the battle royal. And after the match, he is attacked by Bruiser Brody and Abdullah the Butcher under the direction of Sheik Adnan Al-KC. And Jerry turned babyface that night, and I do not remember ever a more well laid out, more orchestrated, absolutely terrifically executed babyface turn than that. It was a sellout crowd at the St. Paul Civic Center, and they were absolutely 100% behind Jerry Blackwell. When he was getting bloodied up at the end of the match, the fans went into this incredible Jerry chant. And from that point on, the rest of his AWA days, Jerry Blackwell was the babyface. When he was a heel here, the first several years he was in the AWA, there was nobody better. And again, you talk about a heat magnet. I think in terms of AWA history, Jerry Blackwell is absolutely a Hall of Famer. Sad to say, he was a big man, obviously, but he didn't take care of himself. He was diabetic, and I know people would see him at grocery stores, after hours, and Jerry was loading up his cart with all the wrong foods and what have you. So, it's unfortunate, that maybe he would still be here, but again, in terms of the legacy of the AWA, you've got to put Jerry Blackwell right in the mix.
Definitely. Were you at that event where he turned?
Oh, I was, and it was. I do not remember a crowd. Seriously, I guess the only thing that I would liken it to, the AWA had a match between Hulk Hogan and Nick Bockwinkel, and the fans thought that Hogan had won the match, and they absolutely erupted, and then Stanley Blackburn reversed the decision or what have you, and they almost went into riot mode. I don't remember a crowd being that absolutely wired at the end of a match as they were that night. The heat in the building, the electricity was extraordinary. Anybody that was there will remember it was just electric. Just a great memory. And as I said, with all the matches, the thousands of matches that I've seen over the years, that one stands out. That may be my favorite of all time.
Well, ironically, I was in the arena that day too, but I was... 1984, I would have been 7 years old, so I don't remember quite everything the way you remember, but I do remember being there. I remember seeing Jerry Blackwell. I knew who Jerry Blackwell was and turning into a good guy, as I would have called him at the time. And then just a few months later, one of my most cherished AWA memories was the Thanksgiving show. He and it would have been Boom Boom Bundy, which people would know as King Kong Bundy, took on the Road Warriors. And what was confusing was that they were the faces and the Road Warriors were the heels. And I think it kind of confused the crowd that night because the Road Warriors did get a lot of cheers even as heels as well at that time, just because people recognized them and knew them. But for me to remember that back in 1984, I'm very thankful for my dad who took me to the events, and we would have been sitting way up in the nosebleed section, so we might not have been quite a part of the chants. But I remember one time in an AWA show, my dad recognized the person sitting right in front of us, and it was bench warmer Bob Lertzema, and my dad recognized him from TV commercials, I guess, because my dad really wasn't a wrestling fan. He was just a great father who took us to the matches, but I got to shake Bob Lertzema's hand, and my dad knew him as a Minnesota Viking, but now I've actually talked to Bob many times through the years and with his history in the AWA, so I remember that from Thanksgiving night of 1984, and so another Jerry Blackwell memory there, but that's just such a small world that we were in the same arena 32 years ago, Mick.
You were 7 years old, and I had just turned 87. So that's amazing.
Yeah. And well, there's one more AWA guy I'd like to talk about on this episode, and just someone really special to me who's not have quite the history in the AWA, but he does have a very memorable feud, and that is Scott Ledoux. When he was a referee for a while, and then he got into a feud with Larry Zbyszko, one of the great wrestler-referee feuds. And for those of you who may not know, Scott Ledoux was a pretty famous boxer. I mean, he boxed Muhammad Ali, or at least sparred with him, and I think he actually had legitimate boxing matches with people like Larry Holmes and a couple other people like that. So he was a tough guy. And that would, I believe this would be about 1986. He got into a feud with Larry Zbyszko, as Larry Zbyszko did not like his refereeing style, or maybe the fact that he wasn't letting Zbyszko get away with all this stuff, so he ended up fighting Ledoux. Do you have any memories of Scott Ledoux in the AWA?
I sure do, and you mentioned that Scott Ledoux was a legitimate tough guy, and no question about it. Scott Ledoux was probably too tough for his own good. He would go toe-to-toe with anybody, whether it was Ken Norton, Larry Holmes, as you said, sparring with Muhammad Ali. And what's interesting, Tim, is that Vern Gagne always liked to get a local sports celebrity somehow involved in a wrestling match or a wrestling angle, what have you. Bob Lertzema, you mentioned just a minute ago, perfect example, and again, Scott Ledoux. Ledoux was tremendously popular around the state of Minnesota. As a boxer, he did fight for the heavyweight championship. That was his claim to fame. His one-loss record, he won more than he lost, but he was a tough guy. And Vern brought him in to referee a couple of matches involving Larry Zbyszko. And Zbyszko, of course, could get anybody over. I mean, Larry was so hated at the time. So you take that, Larry Zbyszko being so hated, and then you take the element of Scott Ledoux being a hometown favorite, you put the two together, and it was magic. And it eventually wound up a boxing match. It was supposed to be a boxing match at Wrestle Rock 1986 at the Metrodome. Scott Ledoux and Larry Zbyszko. And I remember I was shooting pictures that evening for Bill Apter and Pro Wrestling Illustrated. So I was right there at ringside. And Zbyszko got tagged with what looked to be a devastating punch. And I don't know how much Scott Ledoux actually laid it into Larry Zbyszko or how much Larry sold it. I'm sure it was a combination of both. But it was magnificent. And if you look on YouTube, and again, I'm sure it's out there, if you could get past that horrible Wrestle Rock Rumble that they did to promo the event, and you just go right to that footage of Scott Ledoux and Larry Zbyszko at the Metrodome, the knockout punches and were looked just tremendous. So, and Scott Ledoux unfortunately had ALS and passed away, a few years ago. But again, one of those kind of asterisk stars in the AWA, and just a great guy in and out of the ring. I believe he was also the state of Minnesota boxing commissioner or on the commission at one time. So, a Minnesota hero, Minnesota favorite.
Yeah, I mean, towards the end of his life, he was the county commissioner, I believe, of Anoka County up in the northern Twin Cities area. I had the pleasure to meet him one time, and a nicer guy I could not have met. He loved talking wrestling in AWA. I brought the history of Minnesota wrestling book because he was mentioned in that, and so I asked him if he would sign that, and he was more than gracious to do that. But we actually ended up sitting in a Baker Square for an hour and a half, and we went through that entire book, and he gave his opinion on wrestlers, and he was very knowledgeable on what was going on in the whole history of Minnesota wrestling. I was just impressed, and just a great guy. Yeah, and I mean, I felt like I lost a friend there when he finally did succumb to ALS, but I'm so glad I had the chance to meet him. And just something you mentioned during that too is Vern bringing in the local talent, the local celebrities of the area, because yeah, if you watch, I mean, a lot of the fans might have been able to watch Wrestle Rock 86, or I believe some of them were called like Super Clash 1, 2, and 3. And then you'd see, like, this is the sports announcer from KMSP TV here in the Twin Cities. And at the time, that was a lot bigger deal than I'm sure it comes across as today to the fans, because it's like, who is this guy? But in the 1980s, you knew who your local newscasters were, and you knew who your local TV celebrities were.
Well, it's interesting, Tim. Vern would bring in the celebrities, maybe the guest announcer, whatever, but he was very careful. If he put a guy in the ring to wrestle and be a part of a match as kind of a celebrity, they had an athletic background. That was the key. And again, you mentioned Bob Lertzema, you mentioned Scott Ledoux. There's two examples. As opposed to, like, WWE bringing in, whether it's, Bob Uecker or Pete Rose or somebody, or Liberace or whoever it may be. I think it all changed here when he brought in Gene Okerlund to do the original run with Hulk Hogan as his tag team partner. I'm talking about Vince McMahon. So Vince kind of went to the celebrities, and obviously, that manifested itself into the celebrity wing of the WWE Hall of Fame. But Vern would make sure that they at least had an athletic background, and more importantly, that it was an athletic history in the state of Minnesota.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's something that probably doesn't make it through history like it should, but back in the 1980s or 70s when it was happening, it would have been a lot better, and we just don't know it today because we don't know who those people are when we see them like on YouTube or the WWE network or something like that. But that was a big deal to them, and that would actually add a lot to the event that unfortunately fans just don't realize today how cool that really was to be there at the time. And hey, I know who that guy is, and Vern had a lot of ideas like that like you said, he kept it. He probably wasn't as cartoonish and over the top in some ways, but he had. I mean, it was, and you see this on like the DVDs and stuff like that. It's like all these promoters were really smart, and it could have been any of them going global, and because they all had built this product up to where it was. And yeah, I wish the AWA would have lasted a little longer, but at the same time, I'm not disappointed with what it gave us in life, and like you said, what it even gave you in life, and I'm glad that we're able to keep most of it in the library someplace, and you can see it on YouTube, or they've even made DVDs about it. And I thought the WWE DVD of I believe it's called The Spectacular Legends Legacy of the AWA. I thought they did a very good job on that, and they let Vern and Greg and many of the AWA wrestlers speak on that, and I thought they did a really good job of showing exactly what the AWA was in many ways.
No question about it. If Vince was going to kind of tip his hat to a promotion, he did a nice job on that DVD. And in closing, Tim, I know we got to run here. I just want to say from my personal experience in the AWA, I got to thank Nick Bockwinkel, Greg Gagne, Vern Gagne, and Wally Carbo. They gave me not only an opportunity to work with the promotion, but the memories of the AWA, they can never be taken away. Many, many nights I'll sit here and I'll go through my old program collection, the matches that I attended back in the 60s and the 70s, and it can never be replaced. It's a whole different world today. But God bless the AWA. They were it. They were my favorite wrestling promotion, and thanks for the memories.
Well, I can't think of any better way to end this first episode of AWA History than on that note. I want to thank you, Mick Karch, for taking the time to join us as we get this channel going, and hopefully more history of the AWA. I'm hoping you'll be a guest in future weeks, and I think we have so many, just even AWA. We could spend a year just promoting AWA things. I mean, Nick Bockwinkel, we could probably talk about him for 5 shows, and we wouldn't run out of information to talk about. And so I'm hoping in the future that you'll be a regular guest, and that we'll talk more AWA. And if you haven't had the chance, please go over, check out on my channel. There's a Steel Domain Wrestling preview that I did with Mick Karch, and that is definitely worth listening to, as you'll learn a little bit about the current independent scene here in Minnesota. So go to the channel it should be titled Steel Domain Wrestling, and you'll also hear my interview with Mick there, and how we are learning about the show upcoming this weekend, and a little bit of the history of Steel Domain. So once again, Mick, thank you for joining us, and I look forward to talking to you again in the future, and my listeners, I'm sure, thank you as well.
Well, thank you, Tim, and continued success.
Thank you.